We've already been doing a lot of collaboration, but this is just more discussion on facilitating that. And Lin Yuan is the moderator, and she's the founder and editor of Mold, a critically acclaimed editorial platform about designing the future of food. Through original reporting, Mold explores how designers can address the coming food crisis by creating products and systems that will help feed 9 billion people by the year 2050. In addition to the website and a self-published biannual print magazine, Mold hosts events and exhibitions, works with next-generation food brands, and commissions products from emerging designers.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Thanks, Jack. Thanks to the Stone Barn staff for hosting this incredible 2 days of conversation and community. I'm really excited about having this conversation today with this panel of experts. As Kristen mentioned, we've heard a lot about collaboration, especially this morning through just conversations about safety. It was wonderful to hear about how Green Heron collaborates with both Aaron and other designers and to get products from idea to market. And of course, Johnny's has a long track record of really pioneering ways in which we work with farmers and designers together to offer solutions that work for everybody. So I'm really excited about speaking with our panel of experts, and I'm going to let them actually introduce themselves because I think that they will do a better job than I would, but you know, they have, each one here has deep experience and years of expertise working across disciplines, working across with different stakeholders, and I'm really excited to chat with them.
You sure? Why don't you start?
My name is Jesse Smith, and I'm here with the White Buffalo Land Trust. We're a nonprofit out in Central California, coastal California, looking to be a foundation for regenerative agriculture in our region. We are active land managers, currently operating a 12-acre organic avocado ranch, as well as a 5-acre biointensive market garden that we're bringing on track this year, and actively pursuing much larger grazing land. We're just about to start as the newest savory hub for holistic management in our region as well. And a lot of our focus is around farmer training and education, as well as the underlying scientific research and soil health protocols that go behind a lot of these practices that we're implementing. My background, and I think one of the reasons why I'm on this panel, is focused more on print design and product design, which is what my schooling and degrees came from, and I made a transition into agriculture about 6 years ago, and that's the end of that story. I will forever be in agriculture.
If you guys got the pleasure to see Jesse's prototype from yesterday's, his little Post-it note prototype, you would have seen his product design background at work.
I'm Doug Zier. I grew up on a farm in central Illinois. I went to the University of Illinois, which is basically a school with a big ag mantra. And as a senior in agricultural engineering, we went to see what engineers actually do. And oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And so when I graduated, I went to South America with a nonprofit organization. We focused on appropriate technology. Then I bounced back to the home farm for a while, back to Bolivia. And after that, I thought, well, it's time to quit working for a nonprofit. And so, get that. So I went to work for a manufacturer and, had some experiences there that, it was a different one from where I am right now. Currently, I work with Tilmore. I have for the last 4 years. I work in product development, and so hope to share on all those levels.
Hello, hi. My name is Ankita Raturi. I'm a software researcher. I primarily practice what's called agricultural informatics. And so for the last year, I've been working with the Agricultural Research Service of the USDA to try and see if there are ways in which we can redesign tools to allow folks to adopt cover cropping as a sustainable agricultural practice. And I'm sort of transitioning to an academic role again, where I'll be starting up a lab, trying to think about really how can we build a technical capacity for folks who are interested in building tools for sustainable agriculture to start doing this sort of stuff. And so, my background is entirely in software engineering, and that was where all my training was. But in grad school, I visited a farm, and I was like, oh my goodness, I don't want to find bugs in code anymore. I want to find bugs in farms. And so here I am, several years later, and that sort of really inspired me to take a participatory approach to everything that I do. And so collaboration is sort of a very deep part of my process, because what do I know about how to farm efficiently or sustainably? You do, and so it's my job to, in effect, service the sustainable agricultural community through the design of tools. That's
All right. Doran Cox, I'm a farmer and researcher. Our family farm is in about 2 miles from the University of New Hampshire. Diversified operation, somewhere around, and I'd say it's a collaborative operation. I think that's a big piece of what I feel like I'm bringing to agriculture. Is it's fundamentally a shared human endeavor, and in order to achieve the kind of agriculture that I think we all want, it requires essentially that community effort. So even within our farm, we have layered enterprises. So it's it's our land, but it's really this is a community enterprise, and we actively collaborate with dozens of other farms through a shared marketing network with restaurants, schools, hospitals, neighborhoods, to deliver weekly to over 75 locations within daily driving range, and we built shared software to facilitate that process. Also research director at Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment, which carries a similar mission, but is a more public facing enterprise. It's a commercial dairy with a dairy grazing apprentice program, residential 2-year program that we developed in partnership with Stonyfield. It's 600 acres on 4 miles of coast in right outside of Freeport. We also have other diversified operations there. And about 30,000 visitors come through annually. And so our task there is to create intersections between researchers, producers, and the general public, and again, carry this message of agriculture as part of the solution to managing a lot of our tricky social and environmental and economic challenges, and create, I was saying, our goal there is to create an Olympic village for soil health. It's like bring people together and celebrate, and then also replicate and share that idea and ideal, and bringing technology and research to make it actionable, make it relevant, make it useful at the farm level.
Great, and I also would love to just mention that both Dorn and Akita are working on an incredible program called GOAT. Do you guys want to explain what that stands for?
Sure. So we have a lot of fun with one of the key things in building open source communities is that they're based on camaraderie and shared vision and fun, and GOAT is no exception. So GOAT is Gathering for Open Ag Technology, and it's one of many, many communities that I think share some of the core sort of underlying DNA, which is part of the technical ecosystem that includes FarmOS, which is another project that I'm involved with for open source software for farm management, and the Farm Hack community, which shares some of the early DNA that was built on lots of other open source projects prior to it. But do you want to say a little bit more about and there'll be many more GOAT events that we hope that you'll attend, but we'll talk about that more later.
Sure.
Okay. I guess one thing to note, and the thing that I particularly love about the GOAT community, is that it is a way to bring people who might not typically come together to work on ag tech problems. And so you have folks who are from the open source community who have been working on building utility infrastructure for the most part. Or
What do you mean by utility infrastructure?
So like telecommunications protocols, or let's say you're working on I guess when I think about them, it's more like technical infrastructure. And so it's not necessarily something that is domain specific, but it's domain agnostic. And so it can be utilized in any domain, like agriculture. But then you also have farmers who have ideas about how they would like to improve their information workflows. You have designers. And so it's one of these spaces that allows for folks who might not normally, like this actually, right? But who might not normally necessarily interact, come together to try and think about, okay, how can we build together as opposed to working in our silos.
Great, and I think that both Dorn and Ankita have actually mentioned some of their primary collaborators that they work with across both like physical farm communities, but also this online and digital farm communities. And I would love to hear from both Doug and Jesse, like who are your primary collaborators in your day-to-day work as well?
Yeah, well, I guess a couple examples I could give. You know, we like to hear from farmers, especially. We have a farming in the roots of the company. Many farmers that are working in the engineering department have that in their background, so they kind of have the language and you're able to share. We attend field days and workshops and stuff, but I think what has really helped and kind of hone in on what we're doing, is that better? We have each year an event that where we bring farmers in, invite them to come in, and we just focus and we talk. What are the problems that you have? Necessity is the mother of invention. And so we have several people in the organization that have very specific gifts on being able to envision how a machine can work. And they're 7 brothers that basically were a part of this organization and that started it. And 2 of them are in their 70s, upper 70s, still come to work every day and just have a creative mind to, they'll sit and think and, maybe sometimes by themselves, and then they'll get up and the wrenches start flying. And it's fun to watch, but at the same time, after they make this thing, they want to know, is this right? Are we on track? And so the farmers that come in give feedback, we talk about stuff, and that interchange with farmers has been very helpful. And we have partners, the influencers that are on social media that, have gotten on board with a lot of things that are happening. So it's exciting.
So you really have people kind of out in the field who are actually doing the kind of day-to-day, working with the day-to-day tools that you're producing in a kind of feedback loop, like a prototyping and ideation loop with the engineers and the people who are actually manufacturing on the Tillmore side.
Yeah. Also another important component, the family has a small farm, organic, certified, and so all our tools get good usage out there.
And you do this type of event once a year, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Couple, 2-3 days.
If any of the farmers in this audience were interested in participating, did they just reach out to you?
Tillmore.com. We advertised it, I think, on Instagram this last time, which was a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we good turnout.
Great.
In our community, I think that our main collaborator, as many people have said, is around farmers and land stewards. But we see that there's so many different factors to land stewardship. So it ends up being a conservation initiative. It becomes a public policy initiative. We work with schools for environmental education, middle school level school curriculum, elective series. We do a lot with the food service providers, bringing out restaurants, chefs, caterers. The healthcare industry, bringing people out to really understand the source of their food and the connection between soil health and gut health. So we have a lot of different stakeholders within our community that are taking a very active role in our food shed and our food resiliency. And I think as our role as an organization is to really embed a deep understanding of our interconnectedness and kind of the multi-capital accounting that everyone who is seeking for value to come out of landscapes can recognize where that value for them lies. and that capital transition and transaction and accounting is something that we're big into.
So Jesse, can you talk a little bit about actually like establishing a common language amongst all these different stakeholders? Because you just mentioned a lot of really different types of community organizations. And I think that in all of the work that you do, everybody's really working across different communities that each has a different language for how they talk about problems, how they talk about process, what their ultimate kind of vision for a solution looks like, whether it's monetary or health or education. So I would love to understand a little bit about how you kind of establish a foundational groundwork. And this is kind of an open question for all of you as well.
Yeah, I mean, so for us, I think a lot of it kind of is rooted in the core issues of intact ecosystems. So we try to start from a principle level and really root everyone in the fact that all societies and cultures to be healthy require healthy soil, healthy water cycles, biodiversity, and kind of healthy community dynamics. And so from that perspective, there's unlimited nodes where people kind of can connect in and see where the value lies for them. And then from that point, we really start to look at the landscapes that we tend from that perspective of multiple stakeholders. So if it's our local land trust who's looking for oak ecosystem regeneration or fish habitat, they have a vested interest in investing in that landscape and supporting it. If it's a school, it's open space and environmental education. If it's restaurants and chefs, it's quality products, healthy food. If it's the healthcare providers, it's, once again, really understanding that biological process of living microbes in the gut and in the soil and how those are linked together. So yeah, if that.
So you're kind of doing some education first.
Yeah, and that's a big part of our kind of education and training is we separate out training as the future farmers that we need in order to manage the landscapes that are inevitably becoming available as kind of legacy farms transition to new generations. We want to make sure we have an educated youth that has the skills in order to manage these landscapes holistically. And then the education is a little bit more the general public. You may not be out there managing land, but you're making decisions that directly impact land. And so we want to make sure that people understand what those impacts are, how to make decisions that have positive impacts, and that we're addressing the root issues and not trying to solve problems or find solutions to problems that shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because I think that the language question I think is beyond just simply the words we choose. I think it has to do with our design approach and translation across approaches and creating interoperability, not just in our spoken language and breaking down some of the barriers that we have in, say, academic institutions or technical terms and so forth. And so a lot of the work that I feel that I'm involved in is expressed in different ways, but that same basic understanding is creating sort of those translation modules, that common vernacular that in, say, hardware design, it's expressed in a totally different way, a modular design approach with interoperability that can be expressed in a common spacing of a hub, or basically taking the equivalent of a USB connector. And where we have an open architecture that allows for interoperability and allowing for more flexibility and innovation to enable us to build on one another's efforts.
Can you give us like a
yeah.
example of a recent kind of example of this?
Well, it's.
Let's talk about carbon sequestration.
What's that?
I was saying carbon sequestration and shared language of like testing protocols.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's huge right now. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is a project called, and Ankita's involved with this as well, it's called Open Team, or Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management. And it's actually a fairly massive effort to translate all our different ways of evaluating our field observations and being able to use that to hand off those observations to academics that are creating environmental models to explain the way nutrients move through, or use satellite imagery to analyze and interpret the images that they're getting. And then, and the piece that's been missing is, like, how does that translate into a useful form back to farmers, back to companies, back to government agencies that are trying to make good policy, and then how do we translate that in value, the outcomes? And so, because, you know, each of these audiences actually has a very different view into it, and yet we're all actually looking at a lot of the same stuff. So I think there's a huge amount of translation, and I think that's the unifying piece, is that when people see that's what brings people together, is if we can say, if we agree on how to do this, we can build trust, we can have an exchange, we can each individually have our work more meaningful when it's put in context. But it requires essentially that social interaction. So it's not just a collection of making sure the technologies work together, it's also using that desire to create connections and relationships and trust between those communities that's then expressed in what we build together.
So I guess then, if I may add, sort of, when I look under the hood of what it means to sort of navigate the boundary between technical and social interoperability, a lot of it really just boils down to something as simple as thinking about, when does a tomato become a tomato, right? So when does it go from seed to commodity? And then how do you model information about that? And how does that then end up getting modeled in each of our heads? Because we all have different mental models of how we see all of these different objects, how we see them all translating from one to another, and what we think of as the boundary interfaces between all of these objects. And so thinking about those sorts of ideas, at least for me, has been helpful. And then also thinking about, you know, because it is a heterogeneous tool ecosystem, how does my tool connect with yours? How can I make sure that I'm respectful of the way in which you are modeling information, or thinking about your workflows, or thinking about your farm?
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate the same kind of language that Dorn was using, like, how do you take something that can feel very unpersonal, like data, and create a culture of meaning and trust and exchange with farmers, who are the ones who are actually going to be using that data to better the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to formulate some responses. I hope I stay on track. So if I don't, yeah, that's good. So I'm a person who's kind of jumped between the nonprofit world and then the world of manufacturing, and farming as well. So I'm trying to bridge and understanding the language. In the manufacturing world, you know, we talk about capital. And, you know, sometimes in the NGO world, that's a bad word, you know. And so we have to, or rather profit, I guess is the way to speak. But yeah, as a manufacturer, that's kind of that's the thing that says we're on the right track. You know, we use it as a gauge to say, yeah, okay, our decisions were good. You know, whether that's used or abused, that's another story. But so I've become more comfortable with the term profit. I mean, because, yeah, we have to keep our engineers, we have to keep our people on the lines. Everybody has to be paid regularly, or they don't stay with us. So that's kind of the day-to-day aspect of it. Yesterday, when I was getting to know Linyi, she said, wow, what you're doing, it's poetic. And, you know, for an engineer, I thought, what? You know, okay. And then Jack talks about, okay, those who can see the back of the tapestry. You know, we do get involved in the day-to-day aspects. But, yeah, we appreciate the people that see big picture. And I think the poets do. You know, you can be the poet in my revolution.
I wanted to build on that the bringing in the wider community into that vision of what we're doing and why is fundamental to what we're doing in agriculture, and understanding our pieces in context. because I think that is a shift, I believe, in what sort of fundamentally to how this next generation of agricultural production that we're trying to achieve is that it isn't about the farmer in the field as an industry, but it's actually part of what we're doing is trying to engage everybody in agriculture, because that's essentially the foundation of our regenerative economy that we see, and that everybody has some avenue and some piece to contribute. And in order to do that, we have to sort of expose that are seeking that front of the tapestry and not just our piece. So seeking that context. And I think that's where sort of these translation tools, but also just the desire to see that and communicate that this is our intention, I think is also important, is identifying this as not something that we're doing in isolation, and that we're doing this in concert with our local and global community.
And can you talk about, like, I want to hear maybe a little bit of specifics about how that's actually playing out in your day-to-day in action?
Yeah, I just like to give an example of collaboration and how this has worked. We became familiar with a young man from Ontario, had a decent tillage equipment. And, you know, it's a very small company, and so he was nimble. And if you saw our equipment yesterday, you saw the tines with a different color. And, you know, we saw what he was doing. You know, his first design, one of our designers said, you know, he had 3 different sizes of wires. And so one of the guys that works for us, he said, well, you know, you could probably do the same thing with one size wire, and so your volume goes up, and it makes much more sense, you know, for that, you know, the cost point to go down. And so he changed that. It's a cool thing. It's new for us, but you know, if you go to the website, you'll see different colors now, different names, and so, you know, it's a way that we can collaborate with other manufacturers to bring, you know, tools that are reasonably priced down to the customer.
I would love to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of these kind of collaborative enterprises that you guys are working in. And if you could basically share, like mind meld with your collaborators and share a single tool from your professional toolbox with your collaborators that would help you kind of push the conversation forward, what would it be and why? It is kind of a wide question. For me, I would say, because I'm a journalist and a project manager, basically, I herd cats for a living. I would say it would be a deep understanding of how to use and read Excel documents.
Yeah, you gave us a prompt last night that had this question in it. I've been grappling with this all morning because the toolbox is so big. Yeah. And, you know, it's something that it made me come to the realization that there was a distinct difference between working together and collaborating. Because I feel like a lot of the tools we use to work together are, you know, Zoom for conference calls and Slack for communication and Dropbox for file sharing and Google Drive for content creation, and like there's just the list goes on, and all of a sudden we have this huge toolbox for all of the ways that I interact with people, but it doesn't really breed collaboration. And I've come to realize in a place like this how much space is a tool for collaboration. Is the actual, you know, the maker space where people are able to come and interact with people. And what you said right before this was, you know, sitting and watching a mentor or an elder just think for 15 minutes and then stand up and the wrenches start flying, or to see the pause in someone's eyes before they respond to a question. That only happens when you're face to face, and that only happens when you're in a community. And I think that that's an important tool to keep in our minds, is that we actually need physical places for people to meet. And Stone Barns is an amazing example of that, is that, you know, if Blue Hill was somewhere else and there's this farm upstate, I know this people from New York, this is not upstate, but I call it upstate New York. It wouldn't have the same effect on this community. And so, you know, I work in a collaborative, our office is in an impact hub, and the amount of actual collaboration that has come from just running into someone at the coffee pot, or for them stepping into your office, or for the moment where you go to lunch, is way far surpassed the person that you actually have like an MOU with who's across the country and you're jumping on a phone call. Like, that's just interacting with them. And so actual space and place-based collaboration is a big tool for me.
And Keita and Dorn, as people who kind of administer online collaborative spaces, I'd love to hear a little bit about what that means and why, and also about open source, because I think that this kind of physical interaction, there's an openness about meeting someone face to face. How do you, again, cultivate trust and value and meaning in sharing information in online spaces?
Well, I really believe that the software is a reflection of our understanding of systems in general, and so we have to understand the system we're trying to create, and then that the software, the social software that we're building, is our best attempt to understand that system and reflect the values and the trust involved. And so when you see we can build a system that's trustless, that is actually not necessarily a desirable state. We should really be building systems with what the outcomes are that we want in mind. And so I think the tools that we have at our disposal can be used in all sorts of different ways. And I think what we're trying to do is use that toolbox to create a tool that reflects the new set of values. And it is formed through physical, direct relationships with people. And in fact, I don't think that's an option. I think that's a prerequisite. But when we leave those spaces, then we do our best job to reflect that ethic and those values in what we then create. I think that's really important, that constant feedback between these spaces, these hubs of that localize this global system, but then also create linkages that transcend geographies and production systems and cultures and languages.
So I guess for me, decentralized development and the distributed nature of research is sort of like, that's just a thing now. Like, I don't necessarily believe that we're going to have to always come together at the same places. And so designing tools that allow people to collaborate, to get those experiences, that intimacy while still being far apart. So this idea of being alone together is sort of crucial to tool building. And so one of the ways in which at least I've been thinking about it is like, how do you then map the information workflow from one person to the other, right? Because we're both trying to still work on the same problems, it is still important for me to then think about how are you storing information in your local machine, in your notebooks, and then how can we still work together without necessarily dumping everything into Google Docs? And so a simple example of that would be, when it comes to agricultural research, one of the projects that I work with is this massively scaled on-farm participatory research project where it's a network of farmers and everyone's collecting data on their farms, and then we're trying to sort of get a better sense for like how do cover crops perform across different landscapes, right? Because they're such place-based tools. So then how do you start to work together with that information? And one of the challenges these days is that the way in which we've designed software systems results in an ad hoc information workflow. So there isn't exactly a database. It's not entirely clear that the information needs to go from maybe a mobile data collection app or someone's notebook into this form or that. And so thinking about the way in which those transformations occur and then allowing us to work together online and in person is, I think, key at least. I just want to add one more thing. I'm also at sort of like the very beginning of my career in a lot of ways, and so I think part of what these sorts of collaborative environments has given me personally has been the sense of that you're not alone. Especially when you're doing sort of ag tech, I felt like very much at the fringes of something. And so it's been really heartening to come to physical spaces, to have online communities where I can interact with people and realize that we're all kind of coming at these problems with different perspectives, but for the same goals and with shared values.
I wanted to add one more thing to take this interoperable sort of metaphor from the software and into the hardware, because I think it's something that Doug and I talked about, sort of this balance between allowing full creative range and then also allowing that creative range to build on other people's work, and so creating that open architecture. So examples are really toolbar design, for example. Are we standard? We have an inch toolbar. Is it, are we doing also a 2-inch receiver? those things allow for people to innovate and to not necessarily interoperate, but we have a point of intersection where what I build can work with whatever somebody else is building, and they can refine and improve independently, and yet we have a way to bring those together. And I think that's and that's what we're trying to do with software and language and other things, but it has a direct physical manifestation and translations from small tools to larger tools. We can have adapters to take, a Jang seeder and put up a huge toolbar and dozens of Jang seeders, or scale it up. So those are some of the things that I sort of think about from a community perspective, where we can design for those points of intersection.
Yeah, I really like that analogy, being able to improve and innovate independently in a way that person that can continue to feel inspired. I mean, this group, I feel inspired being here. For a time, I also worked as a service manager, and it's kind of a non-glorious sort of a position because you get to hear the bad stuff. And so, at the same time, the inspiration, we can make about anything, and it's really cool. But, will that product then serve the user? Who's going to take care of it in 10 years, in 20 years? Just trying to be a responsible company, we think about, what is our responsibility to the people that buy? They depend on us. So we want that relationship to be positive, because it will then, we can continue to help each other. And so I think that, exactly what you say, how do we make things that are interchangeable? How do we, modular.
Yes.
That's another good word.
And how do we create like a standard for tool makers so that it really can continue to be affordable? I mean, we've heard this morning from the story of Green Heron and this kind of challenge of tooling, and how do we use a standard kit of parts like the Ogun tractor, for example, where things can really become affordable and scalable. And I had a conversation with Michael McGowan yesterday where he was speaking a little bit about this challenge of standardization. I love that Dorn earlier talked about a USB port. Every single person in this room knows what a USB port looks like, because we all own objects that plug into that thing. So as a kind of way to open up conversation, I have kind of two challenges. One is for everyone in this room to think about how do we get from this conversation today around standardization, around modularity, around scalability and collaboration, to actually creating maybe some sort of standardization kit of parts or something along these lines. The second question I have for us, in lieu of questions, because we can do that over lunch, is how do we continue this conversation, not just about collaboration, but in the kind of private, individual, and group conversations we've had over the last day and a half, as we all kind of disband this afternoon. I know we have lunch, and then we have a design roulette, but I would love to hear from the brain trust in this room around how we continue the work once we leave this physical place. Maybe some of our panelists and experts have some ideas, but I would love to also hear from anyone in this room who's been thinking about this.
I would just add to the idea of standards. I think if Horace is here, we had a similar conversation, and he was saying early in his career, he prefers to frame it as open architecture rather than standards. Because standards has the tendency to be sort of a centralized control and sort of suppressive nature, whereas open architecture is about us. How do we define this together, and with the assumption that we can create points of intersection.
And that really goes to the idea of language and trust and value and meaning. So thank you for putting that out there. So let's talk about open architecture.
guess in that vein, standards often will tell you what your boundaries are, whereas starting with having an architecture requires you to then just have a shared base. Going back to this idea of how do you build on each other. And this is sort of why the open source community has been so successful, because if you think about it, like the Linux operating system or many of the, I don't know if that's something that is, well, a lot of these types of tools are like inherently modular, like it's just Lego, right? And so this, one of the things that I'm really excited about is trying to think about, okay, how can we actually begin to create packages that have all of the building blocks that we might need to be able to build reconfigurable systems, reconfigurable information tools for agricultural, in the same way that I've seen so many of you do with hardware. And so I've actually been getting a lot of inspiration from what I've been seeing over the last 2 days, because we're hoping to do that with software too, because at the end of the day, all information tools do is give us the ability to manage complexity. But so just thinking about this idea of like, how do we then build those fundamental building blocks on top of which we can start to do more interesting things?
And, you know, I know this is not kind of a code type architecture thing, but one thing that I've been grappling with is we're coming to market with a consumer packaged good that's a drink, and we're dealing with bottling and glass bottles versus plastic versus, you know, cardboard. And I started looking more into the wine industry, and I just can't understand why every wine bottle is a single-use vessel, you know. And it's just like why haven't taken the Coca-Cola approach, you know, and like you know, and it's one thing. It's like you start looking at, you know, mason jars or, you know, jam jars or all these value-added products, and they're glass, and we're using them as single-use products, and they have to go through this huge industrial, you know, recycling process. And so similarly, it's like, how do you build the modularity so that the creativity can come with labeling, or, you know, with the actual ingredients inside, or product placement, or whatever it may be. But like, let's just agree that, you know, red wine comes in this bottle and white wine comes in this bottle, and then, you know, take it from there. And I feel like it would have such an impact on the culture of food. And anyways.
Reusability has to be like a first-class design characteristic of the things that we're building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let's open it up. I'd love to hear from you guys. Jack, come on up. Like, we can talk about this.
I just have one kind of example about this, but I mean, if we're talking about things that are where we're sharing the same thing, you know, there are a lot of component. I mean, this idea continues to come around. Barry actually sort of sparked this in my mind years ago about just component pieces. Like, that component itself is ubiquitous and available to plug in, the kind of USB idea. And you know, it gets me to think, we've been playing around with drills. Actually, Romaine and I were talking about this morning. So we were talking about how, you know, for 20 years we've been using DeWalt drills or electric drills to plug into different things, from the Tilly to the harvester and the new harvester and all these things. And that's 20 years, right, of time that we've seen the evolution of the electric drill take huge steps forward. The battery technology, the lightness, the power, the longevity, all the things that are around this thing. And in that time, I said I had reached out to Milwaukee to see if they would actually consider the idea of making like just a powered hub. You know, get them out of this. It doesn't have to have a handle. Why are we designing stuff to fit a drill to a thing just because we have it? But what about a little powered motor that actually fits more properly on the things that we have? Or that piece, that adapter, that quick connect adapter that fits on the BCS and the Tillmore and the Planet Junior, and how do we get ourselves hooked up? So all of those things. In fact, the Colt Crest piece that's on the back of that kind of gets close to that, right? Moving those pieces around. So I think that's a huge one. So what do you need? To the extent that we need, what Michael was talking about is that if it's a liability thing, then there's actually, that's kind of the critical mass, right? Like, there needs to be enough power in that group. Call it a cooperative, that all these companies that are working on building these things cooperate on just that piece that allows that thing to be insured or protected or whatever is needed to actually go to market with something like what we were saying with Green Heron. If the issue is that shovel is a $100,000 mold to make, then what's that thing that actually is actually to size, to scale, that could be that adapter for all of us to be using. We haven't heard back. That's what they said. You know,
No comment.
However, the reason we chose Milwaukee, so, you know, we were talking about Festool this morning, actually, which we love. Our friends, you know, a lot of carpenters use that stuff, and great plug and play stuff. But Milwaukee, I just thought, you know, when I was looking at DeWalt and everybody else, like, Milwaukee's got actually a pretty good mission and ethic. And of all of them, as far as I can tell, when we really did the search, they're building their R&D in Wisconsin, and they have this pretty strong program. So I thought, you know, not that I know them from a hole in the ground, but the fact that it's, you know, it seemed like it was easier access. And there are people in their R&D department that focus on, you know, local community innovation type things, and they might just get back to us. We tried to get them to come here.
Invite them to here.
We did.
I think
Maybe next year.
I think a lot of times it's coming in from different angles.
Right. The issue, of course, is that it's like, why doesn't anybody that is building lawnmowers make a small tractor? Because millions of people use lawnmowers and only 100,000 people use small tractors.
I have a tiny proposal, maybe. So, taking the idea of modularity all the way and this idea of wanting to have a kit of pieces that you can basically put together, one of the challenges might actually be identifying what the minimal set of components is that you need, right? So like in a Lego box, you know the different pieces that you have that you can then reconfigure to make a wider range of tools. That might also then sort of help with part of the issue, which seems to be the economies of scale. They might make it if they know there's going to be multiple uses for it. At least that's how we do it with software. So.
I would say the only X factor there, in just direct response, is that the autonomy of farmers in a particular moment does not digest that piece. That's the Lego thing. But
And I would argue that that's where we need to engage beyond farmers and bring in these other communities that are involved in this in the open source community that extends to, you know, roboticists and manufacturers and designers and so forth. And really, I think the key there, and this is something I'm particularly interested in, the battery interoperability is one of the most frustrating things because every single manufacturer actually has a different standard for how they connect. You take them apart, they have the same lithium-ion cells inside. So as long as, but if you can document what each of those poles is and the file for the shape that they plug into, that's essentially that interoperability knowledge that is not proprietary and that can be shared and documented. And so one of the things that we're looking at for our own on-farm electric stuff is along the same lines as using we've seen the new electric chainsaws and lawnmowers and snow blowers, much bigger batteries, and 3D printing and ABS, pretty tough stuff. The adapter, essentially, so that you can then plug it into another device and use those components. So moving that direction. But I think relying on the manufacturers that have deliberately created a proprietary system to as their advantage, I think is going to be challenging because there's a reason that Milwaukee has said we're standardizing on this.
I just wanted to follow the, sorry. Go ahead if you want a question.
So maybe what I'm about to say is a bit of a tangent. But do you think it's worth considering how other industries have standardized things? You know, one thing that comes to mind is like the 3-point hitch, you know, on a tractor. Everyone uses that, you know, and all the tractor companies have it. How did they do it? Or other fields that have done something similar instead of
The Bobcat quick attach.
right.
Yeah, I'll just follow up with the concept of modular and Lego, because that modular, I think, you know, goes into what you're saying. You know, we make toolbars, but we also tell customers that call in, you don't need our toolbar. You know, if you have a 2x2 square tube or an 1.5 inch square tube, you can attach tools to it. We try to play to our strengths, and just to give an example of the basket weeder, the way we were able to enter that market and bring the cost down was by allowing the farmer to assemble it himself. And so the savings was significant, and because it was a tedious job. Why pay somebody in a factory to assemble this if the farmer in the off season has some time on his hands? A lot of them just see that as, oh, wow, makes
It also
sense.
creates value around your relationship with that product.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah.
And to be able to have instructions that they can follow, you know, we got comments, wow, these are great. I didn't have any trouble with this. You know, one guy sent us a video of, well, a time-lapse thing, and his cat walks across, you know. It's really been cool.
Well, on that note, I think we could probably talk about this for the rest of the afternoon, but I also imagine that we're really excited about eating this incredible, delicious lunch that's ahead of us. So let's continue this conversation over lunch. Jesse, Doug, Ankita, Dorn, thank you so much for all of your insights, and thank you to everybody in the audience for participating.